I think that's why we see Moloch being celebrated at Bohemian Grove, why we hear all this discussion of child sacrifice through Planned Parenthood. And we see a group of pagans who know that they run the world. They've had the gold to run the world for 4,000 years, and they're not going to give it up easily.
Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. I'm Doug. Hi, Mike.
Happy New Year, Douglas.
Well, I thank you so much, and Merry Christmas and all the special holiday blessings upon you, the 12 holy nights and the whole thing.
Thank you.
And just incredible. I just shocked that you didn't let the miners come up for Christmas, even, and they dug all the way through to Solomon's mines.
Yeah.
And now your reports are coming directly from the Ophir mines in Tarshish through the Queen of Sheba channel. And it seems as if you have discovered that the great Solomon is a myth of sorts. And so today we're going to talk about the king of Tyre and the queen of Sheba and Solomon the Great and his 1,000 wives and the building he would have had to have built to take care of all those wives. Can you imagine that? And it seems to be now that the Radnite Babylonian story that you have been uncovering has now led right to the throne of Solomon.
Yes.
So what can you tell us about the wisest man who ever lived?
Yeah, we weren't sure where to look after we discovered those banking archives from 600 BC that were clearly identified as Jewish, and we read that these bankers were essentially running Babylon. We started thinking, well, if the record then shows that they had such power, the question was, when did that power begin? When did they establish that kind of control over an entire empire? And so it wasn't a big jump from 600 BC to 1000 BC, which was the reign of Solomon, which was 970 to 931 BC. And I had in the back of my head remembered reading Old Testament scriptures about Solomon and the gold from his temple, and that he built the first temple after the tabernacles, which God didn't want him to do. But that aside, we start looking at how did he finance the funding of this temple. And what we discover, and call me crazy for not remembering my Bible, but what we see is an incredible amount of discussion about the gold that Solomon brought from somewhere called Ophir, with the help of the Phoenician king Hiram II, to build the temple. And specifically, the Bible is clear that he was receiving 666 not shekels, talents. 666 talents a year was being imported into Jerusalem to build this temple. Now, I had not looked up how much a talent is, but now we know it's 25 tons. So he was receiving 25 tons a year of gold from the mines of Ophir. The Bible's very clear about that, to build this temple. And he reigned for almost 40 years. And the Bible says that every year he got 666. Why am I drawing a blank on the, not shekels, but
talents?
Talents. Every year to fund his, not only his temple project, but also his reign, his power base. And he became known for his wealth, according to the legends, his wisdom, and his the size of his family. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now imagine that as an example for a young man from Judah to follow in the footsteps of his king. So there we see a problem developing. And then it just got worse as we began then looking at this Ophir gold mine, and we started seeing the typical obfuscation of our historians over, in this case, 4,000 years, where they were hiding the actual location of the Ophir mines. And the location of those mines has not been discovered or exposed until recent times in our lifetimes, as the mines of Rhodesia or Zimbabwe and South Africa. And then we started seeing the the the, the puzzle pieces start to fall into place. And what we realize now we're seeing is the continuation of the Ophir mines in the De Beers mines of Cecil Rhodes and Lord Rothschild's in the mid to late 1800s. And so then we said, Eureka. The Fear gold mines of King Solomon is exactly the same gold as the British were pulling out of South Africa 4,000 years later. The same place. And the reason there was all this confusion among historians as to the exact location of the Ophir mines is obvious. They didn't want people to know where they were getting their gold. And in fact, it's that same gold and gold mine that has been feeding the corrupt banking system of usury from the Babylonian days right up till today. And it's the same gold, Douglas.
That is one of the bigger discoveries that we have actually come across, isn't it? And
Yes,
yes, there's one other place where the gold in the ancient times came from, and that was Ghana. And nobody really knows. Basically, nowadays, just what within the last 6 months, they've supposedly discovered huge amounts of gold in Ghana, which had already been completely mined out, and huge amounts of gold in Uganda, which there never was much gold there. And so they'll do anything to obfuscate the fact that
right,
Cecil Rhodes and the British East India Company, because that was the initial lands that he had to start with, was
right.
nothing more than a merchant attack to fleece the resources of a country underneath an empire, a corporate empire. And we
Well,
still
keep in
it
mind that
continues.
The British East India Company started in the late 1600s. And what we can see now is that was the territory that they controlled the entire time. So they've been pulling gold out of that area of the world ever since Solomon's time. And what we can see now is that Solomon was a rapacious individual who was extremely greedy. And in fact, that was his downfall. And that he had to control this gold. And these stories of the supposed exile of the Jews to Babylon was nothing more than a cover story for the exile quote of the elites of Jerusalem who went to Babylon to assume control of the banking empire of the Babylonians worldwide. And they had by then bred themselves right out of being Hebrew and were totally Persian. And so then they borrowed the moniker of Judah being Jewish as a cover story that they have been using for 4,000 years.
It seems as if you have discovered, which is shocking because you can't find any real historical references to these things, except that it was well known. It was worldwide known. Solomon's wisdom was known throughout the world. Queen of Sheba came there just to bring him massive amounts of gold and spices and ivory and things which came from Africa. It didn't come from Arabia, which they try to always obfuscate that. That's just to
Right,
throw you off the trail. And then what did she do? She had sex with Solomon, according to some of the legends, had a baby named Menelik, and he, Solomon, gave to the Queen of Sheba to return to her home, which was in Ethiopia, or Oxum, which we now call Oxum, but really was a huge part of Africa. And she was the queen of the whole area. So that area could have stretched to basically most of the gold mines in Africa. And then she was
right,
the top trader She even competed with the king of Tyre, who was Solomon's good buddy, who was basically the king of the Phoenicians. But the Phoenicians had city states, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, and then later Corinth. And they basically controlled the Mediterranean trade with coin. And it was said of Solomon that he was no longer blessed by God because of a few things. First, he built a temple of stone instead of having a temple that was a tent, because they were nomadic people. They weren't supposed to have a temple. And secondly, that he dealt in too much coinage, silver and gold, it says.
Right.
And thirdly, that he started to worship Asmodeus. And Asmodeus is the demon of lust. In other words, his 1,000 girlfriends, wives and concubines. Plus, let's remember, each one of those was an alliance for him to grow his kingdom. So
Right.
I think the picture that you painted for me recently is pretty interesting, in that also Solomon gave, as I said, if I didn't say, I'll say again, a copy of the Ark of the Covenant, which was solid gold, the mercy seat, and whoever sits on it literally has the voice of God speak through them. And that is still claimed to be an oxum to this very day and never been shown to the public. And they have a cult around it ever since the time of Solomon. It's been continuous, and their carvings into solid stone to make their temples, make them a very unique culture. And then their stelas and their obelisks are so ancient and so profound, no one understands them even to this point. So, did Solomon have a child with the Queen of Sheba? Well, obviously. If not, then it's an analogy to he gave over the child of Israel and literally the Ark of the Covenant, which inside was supposed to have a copy of the Ten Commandments on stone. And that was supposed to be what they were working out of. Well, Solomon broke every one of those commandments and every other one. I mean, he married every wife that he married. He would allow them, and that's the reason he had to keep building his palace, because he would allow his wives and his concubines to worship the gods and demons of their own religion.
Right.
And at that time, pan religious ideas had become so common that people literally called on the names of demons to protect their cities. And everybody had their own demon that they worshipped and their own god. And that's the reason that Abraham said, no, we're just going to have one God. But according to Abraham, it was his God, and only he talked to that God.
Right. It's real clear. We think in terms of monotheism today, largely, but back then, Solomon was building temples to other gods, including gods and goddesses of the women that he married, and the kingdoms he was doing deals with. So we're looking at a very interesting character. But if we go back to the gold issue, I think that that's the unifying thread here. That they had a big mine in Rhodesia, which is now fairly well known that Ophir was what is now Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes. And by the way, there's one very iconic picture of him where he is standing on a map of Africa with one foot planted down in the Cape of Good Hope and the other one planted in Egypt. And that one of his tasks was to build a rail line the entire length of Africa along that Gold Coast where they had been pulling gold out. Now we can see that this was the big secret of these bankers, these Jewish bankers from back in Solomon's day. They were pulling gold out of there. They were keeping the location of those mines secret, and they were sending it back to initially Solomon, and then after he died, no doubt that secret was buried with those who were running the Silk Road trade, the money changing in Babylon, and so by 500 BC, we find these clay tablets where they're very clearly identifying these Jews, which are clearly not Jews, that were running the banking systems for the entire Silk Road, which was in fact the entire economy of the known world at the time. So we now, I mean, it's mind boggling to think that uh, something as simple as that could be a unifying factor for all these demons that we're dealing with. But clearly, by the end of Solomon's life, he was building temples to Moloch, to Baal, which are still in play today, and that he had given over his belief in the one God to uh, polytheism, and that the bankers of that day who used the name Jewish were in fact the purveyors of polytheism to this day, and they do not worship the God of Israel or the God of Jesus Christ or any other God. They worship these pagan gods, and they always have. And that is one of their secrets, I think. I think that's why we see Moloch being celebrated at Bohemian Grove, why we hear all this discussion of child sacrifice through Planned Parenthood. And we see a group of pagans who know that they run the world. They've had the gold to run the world for 4,000 years, and they're not going to give it up easily.
That's for sure. And Solomon may be like the Rothschild held gold bullion bank in the city of London, which then backs up all of the British currency. It may be Solomon's gold that went to Babylon to bank to be the assets that backed up all the fractional banking that started
Yeah,
in Babylon, which is one of the greatest evils. Because when you have fractional banking, then the bank doesn't even have to have the money that they loan out to pay you back if they're holding your money, as well as they get to charge usury. They get to charge whatever interest they want. Plus, that's also where you paid your taxes and where your land was proffered and controlled, and where the justices of the land were also the same people who were determining your taxes. So
right.
Solomon or the Aradnite Babylonians, we knew that they had taken over the Babylonians when they went there, either magically during the supposed exile, which seems to be a mythological point here, or Solomon had already sent them there, and even David before him, because David also aligned with Hiram of Tyre and had his builders come to build David's palace, which
As
was
well as his ships,
as well as his
his
ships.
Phoenician ships.
And so you have Solomon and King of Tyre best buddies. Now, in Ezekiel in the Old Testament, it says that the king of Tyre was basically, they insinuate Satan. He was Satan. But in another passage, they say that he was acted as a cherub, protecting the covenant. And it's like, what? Well, what is he? Is he a demon? He's probably the character Lucifer that we find who fell from heaven, because it was the king of Tyre who gave to Solomon the green bowl that was considered the Holy Grail. But at the same time, we hear that the Queen of Sheba delivered that. But the Queen of Sheba was very good friends with the King of Tyre, and they are all three practically mythological. But I don't think that historians are very smart to ignore the fact that the child of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, Menelik, was a very real person. An entire dynasty was started. They certainly do have a copy of the Ark of the Covenant, and they may be, or we do know that the Black Ethiopian Hebrews are more Hebrew than Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, or most other people who claim to be Jews. So we need to follow that thread. And it's bizarre what you had pointed out, because I didn't know this. The fleet for the Hebrew kings, Saul, David, Solomon, at least, were built by Philistines. They were built by Canaanites. But they were especially built by the Phoenicians. Well,
Right.
the Phoenicians really only kind of exist in history from about at the maximum 1500 BC until they fizzled out in 300 BC or so, when Alexander conquered the whole area. But the king of Tyre was considered mythologically, had everything. He was the greatest trading king. And you pointed out, which I never realized this, I must have missed it in my reading, that Solomon was referred to as the merchant king. Well,
Right.
that's what we're talking about. We're talking about merchant warriors who ruled with a sword and certainly kept Ophir, uh, Tarshish, and the Queen of Sheba's Saba, because she was from Saba in the south, probably probably Grand Zimbabwe, just as you said, which at that point, if she was the queen of Grand Zimbabwe, which was the oldest culture in Africa, then it could have easily encompassed all of Ethiopia and what we know as Aksum now, and the whole area, even imaginably the other gold deposits in Ghana, which are significant but do not compare with all the gold that's been taken out of what we now call Rhodesia because of uh, Cecil Rhodes. I'm trying not to say something derogatory because of Cecil Rhodes and the British. So, why did the king of Tyre, who was basically the king of the Mediterranean merchant fleets, uh, share the gold of Ophir, which Solomon claimed right to? They call it the mines of Solomon, the gold mines of Solomon. How was it that the king of Tyre shared his ships to go on this trip that sometimes took 3 years to complete? And to begin with, the first two times that they brought the gold in, it amounted to 32 tons of gold in two shipments alone. And then, as you pointed out, 666 talents per year, which I forget how many tons that is a year. In other
Just
words,
25 tons a year.
that's more gold than anyone had except for Egypt. And so, of course, it came from Africa. And of course, it came from the same places where that provided gold for the Egyptians because they were obsessed with gold. But they, I think, went the long way around out the Mediterranean, past the Pillars of Hercules, down into Africa to some port. Could have been Ghana, could have been on the eastern side of the western side of Africa, and they would bring this gold back. But then you have pointed out that you can't find a single coin that is minted by the Hebrews, Solomon, David, Saul, anybody, that
Right.
somehow they took over banking for the Sogdians and the whole Silk Road and basically the land routes for the merchant traders of the world. So could it have been Solomon's mysterious gold, which was never found? None of the vessels, the huge amounts of vessels and candelabra, the gold gilding inside of the temple, none of this was ever found, not one single speck of it. So
Right.
where did that gold go?
Yeah, there's some interesting histories written how trying to explain how it disappeared. And usually it's with some broad statement like uh, it was Jerusalem was decimated by the Egyptian, and the Egyptians carried it all away, and then they move on to another subject. And that's usually a telltale sign that somebody's trying to hide what really happened to that. I think that's it's probably not a lot of question whether the gold existed or not. Um, what I think was going on is between Tyre, the King Hiram, and Solomon. Is Solomon had a tight relationship with Babylon, and Babylon was running the Silk Road, and Tyre was a maritime operation. So I think that Solomon brought to the king of Tyre a connection to the Silk Road so that the Phoenicians then could take the goods coming from Babylon into Israel to the coast and could take those on into Europe. And I think that's probably the deal that was cut because there's been never been a discussion that the king of Tyre ever tried to usurp Solomon's deal with him. I have never read a record that actually occurred, but the suspicious element of this, and here we have to look at the British, because in the mid 1800s, the British were on a tear to dig up everything they could dig up in the Middle East, and they had these tremendous. they created these tremendous propaganda stories of the exoticness of working in Babylon and Egypt, and that they were pulling up all these antiquities, and that where were they taking a lot of them? To the British Museum in London. And what it's pretty clear now is that the British were hiding the evidence. As archaeology became more well known and more people were starting to dig from universities all over the world, they had to figure out a way to hide their secret of the gold of Ophir. And I think that's what was going on in the mid 1800s. And that was at the time our robber barons were starting to make their moves, both in England and in the US. And isn't it magical that they had control of all the gold by then? But that's because I think that the British East India Company had taken charge of it, had secured the knowledge of it, and controlled any kind of news coming out about it through their propaganda machines. And so when the evidence started emerging in the mid 1800s, they went they went there. They started these extreme archaeological digs where they were just digging it up as fast as they could, sticking it on barges on the Euphrates River, and then sinking it all. And, and since then, 50 years later, uh, more archives have emerged which prove what we're saying, that by 600 BC, the Jews of Babylon were running the Silk Road and were also running Babylon, and that was exactly the same time that we have this exile, three exiles actually from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, I always thought that was a lot of people, but we just double checked. And if you take the book of Jeremiah's account, we're talking in three exiles, a total of about 4,500 people. And some speculated that was just the men. So add your families to that. That was it. That was the extent of this exile into Babylon. And by the way, it was the elite of Jerusalem that went to Babylon. The craftsmen, the bankers, the elite of Jewish society in Jerusalem were the ones that were taken to Babylon, where, by the way, the Agibi family, the Marushu family, now they're finding other ones, were already running Babylon. So what is this exile? It looks like they were just having a vacation time among their relatives. And so, I did a little list, by the way, Douglas. I sent you this. I don't know if you got a chance to look at it, of all the anomalies that we have begun to see in trying to figure out who these Jews were that we're talking about in history. First of all, Solomon. What kind of an example is a man who had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and who was in love with gold? He built a temple. He worshipped Baal, Moloch, Aramon. Temples of Ishtar, prostitution obliterated Jewish blood 1,000 years ago, 1,000 BC. And then they turned the narrative away from priests and prophets to rabbis. They created the Talmud in Babylon. They created Yiddish in Babylon. And then we see this disposition of gold, 666 talents of gold, which is $1.3 billion today, by the way, per year, which is 50,000 pounds or 25 tons per year. And that the Bible talks about all King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Babylon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. That's actually in the Bible. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea, along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years, it returned carrying gold, silver, ivory, and apes and baboons. And that's 1 Kings 10. In another account, the 666 talents was every year. Now, I point out, that's obvious, 666. I never knew that. I never saw this correlation. We talk about the whore of Babylon and the mark of the beast as 666. The only other place we see that reference to that number is Solomon's gold. So aren't we seeing a connection over 4,000 years with this message that 666 is a sign of the devil, and that Solomon initiated that in his lust for gold, and that we're still suffering from the seven deadly sins that he helped inject into humanity. uh, to those demons were in fact given charge over Solomon's gold to this day, and that those are the demons we're fighting right now.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I think that Solomon moved his operation to Babylon so he could indulge in the prostitution temples of Ishtar and Inanna, which he was, of course, accused of, and is accused of one of the three things that caused him to have his downfall. The second, of course, being coinage. So, since he didn't make gold coins and everything was gold that he had touched, obviously, King Midas, uh, then what did he do with the gold? It must have been the assets behind common currency. So I'm
Right.
going to suggest that he basically, just like the Rothschilds do in every central bank, buy up the right for currency exchange,
So
production, and minting.
it appears that the Rothschilds were given this franchise as Rodonite Jews, Rodonites, Babylonian Rodonites, were given this franchise that they then pushed out through uh, the 1700s, coming forward to today. Because otherwise, how would they have gotten that much gold? They were given the franchise for the Babylonians that carries forward to this day. Let me point out a couple other things. The Knights Templar, after the First Crusade, started a bank that was a no interest loan bank. Within a couple hundred years, the Pope had made sure that that was just crushed by these court Jews. We have historical confusion on key elements of the Jewish narrative, and we have modern British interest in Persia, Iran, Syria, and the Levant, the home of the Radonites. So we are not fighting Jews, we are fighting Babylonians, and they have hidden behind Judaism. That's my conclusion. For 4,000 years, there are way too many anomalies. Here's some others. There's a curious confusion surrounding Jewish history, like the exile, the Talmud, Yiddish, Ashkenazi, British control, gold mining. We see Jewish bankers controlling Babylon during the three captivities, sixth in the 6th century. We see that, quote, Jews ruled the Sogdian Silk Road from the 6th century BC. And that isn't it curious that in the ancient um, artwork of the Sogdians, we see that they look uncannily like Ashkenazi Jews today. And so, what we now know from DNA is that they are related. That the Ashkenazi Jews are in fact Persian, Turk, and not Hebrew. Um, we see the emergence of the Talmud and the Talmud academies in Babylon. That was not the Hebrew belief system. This was a system that was created to put rabbis in the place of priests and prophets, and let the rabbis then decide what was going to be presented as Judaism going forward. So, what we have been fed today is a creation of the Babylonians. Um, we see the emergence in the 1700s of the Illuminati, the Sabbatean Frankists, and false messiahs. And there we get into some of the things you've talked about. Is since the Hebrew was bred out of the Jews 1,000 years earlier, they essentially created a new type of messianism, that since they can't give birth to uh, the uh, uh, the return of the Messiah, then they'll force it by being as evil as they can be in order to cause a cataclysm in the world. And I think that's what we're seeing now in this immorality that we're addressing. And then, interestingly, we see a sudden disappearance of the Radonites in the 11th century, and then the magical appearance of Ashkenazi, Talmud, and Yiddish. Um, and then we see the sudden appearance of the Rothschilds in the 1700s. And as we have discussed many times, Rothschild was not their family name. Their family name was Bacharach. and they just changed the name. And then all of a sudden, magically, these sons of Mayor Amschel Rothschild were given control of the banking systems in most of the major European cities overnight. And then we see this unexplained emergence of royal houses in Europe tied to court Jews. And there, I think what we're seeing is that our royal houses were, in fact, Babylonian Radhanites as well. And they got the court Jews in there to play with the notion that Christians didn't want to charge interest, so they let their court Jews charge interest, when in fact they were cutting deals on the back end. And that's the system that we are suffering from today.
The banking horrors of Babylon. And they're to this very day very proud of it. And they make sure to pass it on from in their lineage down to their children. It's a type of corporatocracy. It's this aristocracy of banksters and of people who have been able to use stores of gold as the magic assets that then can drive entire currencies. Matter of fact,
Right.
they don't even have to have as much gold as is in the currency. That's no longer a deal. They just charge you more interest for it if you go beyond the amount that the gold they have to back it up is available. So this has been going on since Babylon. So here's what I'm going to take a step out here. I'm going to suggest that the king of Tyre, who was considered to be Satan fallen from heaven, Lucifer fallen from heaven, who was considered to be the man who envied everything in the world, which the demon of that is Leviathan. But the demon that fell from heaven fell by pride. Okay, so you have, with beyond a shadow of a doubt, the king of Tyre, literally they say he was a cherubim and he fell from heaven and he fell to his kingdom out on the island of the king of Tyre. And he was Solomon's counterpoint. And Queen of Sheba stands in between them. So you have Lucifer on one hand, who also taught then his friend Solomon all about Asmodeus, because the king of Tyre was also noted for the whoredom of his kingdom and his worship of money. So he
Right.
taught Solomon all about Mammon. He taught Solomon about Asmodeus. He taught him about Leviathan, about Lucifer. And then, of course, it's gluttony. Well, what more gluttony could we see in the demon Balifor than with Solomon? His history is a history of gluttony of every imaginable desire, which he didn't seem to be able to satiate, so he continued. 1,000 wives. I don't know that he would have stopped there. And if it's true or not, it doesn't matter. It's trying to demonstrate the amorality of the person that's supposed to be the king of a religious tribe, Israel, that is the chosen tribe. They are not chosen. This king is leading them in the opposite direction. And then in the middle stands the Queen of Sheba, who has his child and then carries on the Hebrew tradition better than Solomon does. Solomon lets it go to Babylon, where the horrors of Babylon then create Babylonian Radhanite bankster horrors, who then took over for the Sogdians and then became, as you say, more Persian than they were Hebrew. And this is something they still brag about. They still refer to things in the Old Testament as if there's morality there, where, as far as I can tell,
Right.
what I usually find is the worst forms of immorality that I've ever seen. So the Queen of Sheba has Menelik, he has the Ark of the Covenant, and their religion goes on undefiled to this time. And they
Yeah.
are, as I have said, the truest Hebrews on the face of the earth.
Well, think about his example that he set for the young Jewish men of Israel and Babylon. Between his 700 wives and 300 concubines, and the obvious message that sends to a young, strapping, teenage Jewish man. And then you send some of them to Babylon, where they've got the Temple of Ishtar, which is a temple of prostitution. So it's the idea of prostitution is elevated to godlike status. Just imagine yourself as a young Jewish man having to decide your particular morality when every authority figure in your life and in your empire is whoring around. You mean you're not going to do that? No, I think they did that to the point where the Hebrews ceased to exist. That's
And
obvious.
and that is the beginning of the two oldest institutions on the face of the earth: prostitution and taxes. and
Right.
and you add fractional
Exactly.
banking, and you add being landlords, ruthless landlords, and you add the Hammurabi Code that basically backs up the merchant warrior instead of backing up the common person. You are in a divine heaven of whoredom. And,
Correct.
and to this very day, when we're looking at these people, we should just call them Babylonian horrors, because that's what they are. And they're gluttonous horrors. I always would look at the seven deadly sins and say, gluttony, Balfour, well, I'm never going to get to gluttony. I barely have enough to survive. I don't have enough to be gluttonous. But now look at the people who are rich. They're the worst gluttons on the face of the earth. And they are leviathans of individual ego aggrandizement, trying to get more, get more, get more, and live longer so that they have time to spend it. This is nothing more than what we saw happen with the Hebrews in Babylon, and basically learned from you could call Solomon, because of his wrath, uh, and the Hebrew people, because of their wrath, because of the pogroms they were told by God to conduct. When they would conquer a kingdom, they had to kill every man, woman, child, animal, knock down the buildings, and salt the ground. Well, that's wrath, that's anger. Well, that's who Solomon is. But he's also the other deadly sins. So we're talking about a man who embodied the seven deadly sins, that is then seen to be a prophet, a king, and somebody who was good.
Well, think about the idea of him being wise. And back in the day when I was a younger entrepreneur, um, raising money, and I was often contacting some of these merchant banks, international merchant banks, to talk about funding for a leader. And going to visit these people was like entering a throne room. I mean, it was the aura around the money, and the power that goes with money if you have it, or the desire you have to get some of it in order to achieve your objective, is just off the charts. And so, what we're seeing with Solomon, who would not consider him wise if telling him he was wise would get them the money they need? And so, like, he was the ultimate venture capitalist, so everybody's going to think he's wise. Oh man, he is a brilliant guy. I mean, look at all these entrepreneurial magazines, Money Magazine, Fortune Magazine, how they exalt the success of many of these bankers, and sing their praises. uh, I think that perhaps with Solomon's wisdom, we're seeing basically Solomon's power, that he threw at these people, and they considered it wise. I don't know.
Well, he tried to prove his wisdom with something he did when he designed the temple. He created a thing called the molten sea, or the brazen sea. In the outer court, there was the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and then there was a sanctuary around that. And you had to be the elite, the elect, to go into that one. But to go into the Holy of Holies, only the high priest on Yom Kippur, one time of the year, could go in there, because he would look at the seat of mercy and it would speak to him, and he would be overwhelmed by light, and they had to tie a rope around his ankle to pull him out beyond the veil, once he'd gone into the Holy of Holies, if he passed out, because they didn't want him being burnt alive by the light that was emitted from this Ark of the Covenant. But on the outside, in the outer court, Hiram tried to build something of his time, which I think is an indication of what we're really talking about here. But first, I'll say that the transition from the matrilineal, or the matriarchy, to the patrilineal, or patriarchy, is displayed in the story of the love of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, in my opinion. And so, about 2000 BC is when that transition happened. And you can see that because they started to build walls at that time. They started to have names for weapons, and they perfected weapons. And they had to perfect metals into weapons. And so, what were they trying to do? Well, we name our ages: the Gold Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. And now you could call it the Steel Age, or the reduced graphene oxide age. But the point is that that is also what instruments of war were made out of. And so the taming of the brazen sea, the taming of the molten sea, Hiram Abiff, the builder, who was a stonemason, what was called a Dionysian artificer or an ancient artificer, someone who could build out of stone so that it would stand, the test of time. He also wanted to
Yeah,
create.
those guys were pretty good. I mean, their structures are still standing today, some of them.
It's totally amazing. And so he wanted to build this amazing thing where the priests would have to wash themselves before they went into the inner temple where they were allowed to go. And it could hold 150 baths, and it was made out of bronze, and it could be heated up, and it was on the back of giant bronze oxen, and it was outdoors. And this is what created, of course, the pillar of smoke in the daytime and the pillar of fire at night. Okay, but now when they wanted to take that from a tent tabernacle and turn it into one of the wonders of the world, Hiram Abiff, the builder, decided to undergo this task of mixing all the metals until they came out into a perfect metal that would create the calm sea, calm of the sea, or the mirror of the sea, that the temple priests would enter in to wash themselves, but when they would come out, they would be immortal. Okay, well, that didn't happen, as you might imagine. That didn't work out too well. As a matter of fact, he was killed in the process by 3 jealous apprentices and thrown into this molten sea. But when he was
Well,
in the
wait a
molten,
second. Okay, I'm an engineer. I got to ask this question. If it's a molten sea, then any human member is going to get burned up if you put your toe in it. So what are we
correct,
talking about here?
we're talking he was thrown into the molten sea. He went to the bottom and he met Cain, Cain and Abel.
I'll bet.
And Cain gave him a hammer and the secret magic word that would be able to tame, what are they saying in the analogy? The mixing of metals to create a metal that would be immortal. In other words, one that wouldn't rust, one wouldn't stain. And so, in about 300 BC in Israel, we know that they started mixing meteorite with bronze, copper, tin, and other metals because they found it in the spearheads of the Israelites.
Did you say 300 BC?
Yes.
Okay.
But we know that the Magna Hasta of a Roman centurion in 100 BC certainly did have meteorite in it. We have
Right.
had that proven through studies we've done. But the point is that I think they're talking about the fact that the master builder Hiram was trying to impress the Queen of Sheba, who he was in love with, according to the stories, the folklore. And he was trying to create this taming of the brazen sea, which, of course, if it would have given the priests immortality, it would have given Hiram Abiff immortality now, wouldn't it, if he had accomplished the task? But he didn't, and it exploded. And when fire and water met, a huge explosion happened. Well, what are we talking about here? And what is it? Why does a human have to be thrown into the mix? The human is carbon. When you're a smithy, you use your own hair and fingernails and any part of your body that is shed that is carbon, and that you throw it into iron to turn it into steel because
Right.
you're mixing carbon with iron. So that's what they're talking about here. So we're talking
Right.
about.
I mean, any engineer knows that it's carbon hardened steel.
Yes. And so what we're talking about is Hiram Abiff was trying to make the new weapon and doing it through metallurgy. Well, Solomon was all about metallurgy. He was about gold. Matter of fact, he didn't even like silver in his kingdom because they had so much gold, everything was gold. And so, what are they talking about here? It means that Solomon became the wisest man in the world through his marriages and associations with many, many tribes. He learned the evil of the king of Tyre and went beyond him. He allowed Hiram Abiff, the builder, to try the experiment, which in the end, since Solomon was the wisest man, they had to figure it out because that wash basin was used in the temple, supposedly, according to the legends. So they must have worked something out. So I say that the wash basin was bronze, but because they needed to heat it so hot They put meteorite in it and hardened it because that's what meteorite does. It has cadmium, it's got palladium, it's got iron, it's got all these great metals in it. And all they had to do was find some meteorites. And around all the temples, meteorites were considered sacred. Even the Kaaba, which was to this very day, has a meteorite embedded in it that the believers of Islam circumambulate and kiss one time in their life. They make that promise as a Muslim to do that. So meteorites are very important. And so I think you're seeing here that with the Queen of Sheba and the whole Grail myth, that the King of Tyre had the Grail, gave it to Solomon. Queen of Sheba had the Grail, gave it to Solomon. Hiram Abiff, the builder, basically was trying to manifest the Grail and give it to Hiram, but certainly did give him the secrets of metallurgy, which would then say that it's very possible that our theory here that Solomon's gold was used for the bankers of Babylon, and it would have been cast into ingots or into bars, probably by Hiram Abiff himself, the builder. And that's
Well,
what this is
according to the
about.
Bible, it was cast into all kinds of shapes.
Exactly. Which is, again, another indication that Hiram Abiff was a metallurgist who was turning anything into gold that Solomon wanted, which was everything. So why weren't there gold coins? Because Solomon had the demon, Belphegor, the demon of gluttony, turn him into a dragon sitting on a gold hoard. Something had to have happened with the gold, and since we don't know anything that happened with it, it must have become the gold that is still used today in our criminal bankster industry.
Well, I did some checking, and I wondered if gold had a fingerprint, and whether you could determine where gold came from this fingerprint. And we've confirmed, yes, gold does have a fingerprint, and it's not a simple process, but you can figure out where gold comes from. And since they've done such a masterful job of hiding where the mine is, the mine of Ophir, it's quite possible that no one wanted anyone to figure out where Ophir was, and they had been successful at doing that up until probably the 20th century. But as it's starting to come out now, we're seeing that this gold that these guys have layered sin upon sin upon sin upon sin for 4,000 years is now the gold that's being used to lever our fiat currency banking system. And it appears that that system, after 4,000 years, is collapsing.
And yet it's collapsing in the hands of the same people who've
Yeah.
been controlling it for so long that you actually, you can practically follow it back in its provenance to exactly which families handled it, where it went after that, because this wealth, portable wealth in gold does not disappear, folks.
Right.
It does not disappear. It can be recast. It can be melted down and turned into simply whatever coinage that the person who just won the war wishes to turn it into. And now, doesn't Cecil Rhodes, isn't his face? Oh no, that's the Krugerrands. Yeah, the Krugerrand gold coins have the face of a white man on it.
That's Kruger.
Yeah, Kruger. Yeah. So here it is. These all came from Great Zimbabwe, the greatest African nation of all times, which Rudolf Steiner pointed out was one of the three places that the three Eves of Africa actually came from. So when we're talking about the lineage of the Queen of Sheba being female, and that she might have been one of the greatest powers in Africa at that time, well, remember that in Phoenicia, in Tyre, it was Europa, the Princess Europa, who was taken to the island of Crete and founded the Minoan culture. It was Dido who was taken from Sidon or Byblos, one or the other, to Corinth, and she founded the Corinthian culture, which was the counterpoint to the Roman culture. The Corinthians were as powerful as the Romans were. And so when you're talking about Phoenicia, you're talking about the same exact Semites as the Hebrews, the same ones as the Amorites, as the Moabites, as the Philistines, as the Canaanites. it would be fair to call Phoenicians and all of these groups, including the groups that were all underneath this association, I call it an association of Midians, that Abraham seemed to have been the father of most of those tribes. This has been going on for a very long time, but it is a transference from the female matriarchal centered cultures into the male. And unfortunately, that seemed to have been accompanied by a worship of the seven deadly sins. And Solomon, who wrote supposedly was the author of the Greater and Lesser Seals of Solomon and the Solomon's Testament, those are grimoires. Those are books to control demons. He literally built temples for demons for his
Correct.
wives. They weren't even gods. They were demons, and they were known to be demons, and you had to sacrifice humans and many other things to these beings. And they were local gods who literally were just part of an infinite pantheon of fallen deities, as it were. And so he was the biggest worshiper of them all to this very day. His sign, or the ring signet of Solomon, the king, or King Solomon's ring, is considered the most powerful sigil in all of magic. And if you want to look up any demon, you can look it up in one of his books.
Well, don't the Freemasons love to talk about the Seal of Solomon?
Totally. And they're all about, the whole Freemasonic thing is all about the building of the Temple of Solomon and Hiram Abiff, and what Hiram Abiff, the builder, goes through. And what we're talking about is the transition from the female culture to the male-oriented culture, and from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, using the most sacred thing to the matriarchal culture.
What era are you talking
meteorites.
about here? 3000 BC? 4000 BC?
The transition happened around 2000 BC.
2000. Well, that was at the time of the Hammurabi Code.
Yes, and the men started to take over where it was priestesses principally before, and where the triple God that we call the Father, Son, Holy Spirit was called the triple goddess of Mother, Daughter, Holy Sophia, and call her Isis, call her Cybele, call her Ishtar, Artemis, Hecate. She's got 1,000 names. Even Hercules was, look at that. That's actually the hero of Hera. Well, in the story, Hera hated Hercules. So when they turned the female hero of Heracles to Hercules, they forgot to change these things. And you can see it in the culture by going to the Minoan Islands, or to Crete, or to any of these ancient places, where you will see that it's prominent that the female culture was the dominant culture until the time war was created. And I would contend that until the time came that coins were then issued beyond the realm of the temple, which at first they were used to represent grain, but as soon as coins were used, and or letters of credit, or bankers started to do fractional banking, and or taxes started to be a standard thing, a yearly thing that had to be paid, it was a matriarchal culture, and you didn't have to fight over
I'm not
anything.
sure your point here. So what we have the Hammurabi Code, which we know we have it actually on a stone, and we're talking about banking there. So you're talking about a transition between a leadership transition. Is that what you're talking about in humanity, between matriarchal cultures to patriarchal cultures? And are you saying that occurred at about the time of the Hammurabi Code?
Yes, at that time it was Tiamat was the supreme goddess, and then Ishtar came beneath her. And
But
then,
Ishtar was the Babylonian goddess of
right, yeah, which is a remaking of Inanna, which is a remaking of Tiamat. And
okay.
so these goddesses were the temples. So it was the transition. You see it in the temples, where you no longer worshipped the triple goddess or female gods, and money started to leave the temple, and coinage started to rule the day. And at that point, that's when basically,
So are you saying that that's when the values of humanity changed?
yes, and that's
Okay,
when the seven deadly sins began to rule cultures.
interesting. Well, we you're not going to make me track it back another 2 or 3,000 years, are you?
Yes, unfortunately, we do need to
Oh,
go back to about 3000 BC so that then we can explain the monolithic builders. Where did they get the skills overnight to
to
build
do what?
the monolithic structures that we have, from
Like what?
pyramids to the beautiful walls in Peru, these gigantic, 50-ton rocks that are perfectly placed, and all these megalithic structures from Angkor Wat to the 10 different pyramid cities in China, which have yet to even been
Oh,
archaeologically
I've been
opened
to
up.
the one in Indonesia, Borobudur.
Yeah, yeah, Barbadura, this is amazing. How did they build these things, and how come they
Right.
weren't built before? And why did they all represent star clusters? And those star clusters, when you roll them back in time, you see that they projected onto the Earth around 10,500 BC. So yes, we would have to go back to 10,500 BC to satisfy
No.
my explanation of most of what is happening in our modern
Oh.
life. Yes.
So we've been roaming around in 4,000 years for 4,000 years, and you want us to go back to 6 to 10,000 years.
I want to go
Okay.
back to 10,500
So
BC.
let's stick with
Yes.
gold and Solomon. How about that for
Well,
the moment?
I just also want to point out that the people who think the Anunnaki aliens make us dig up gold so they can come around every few thousand years and collect it because that's how they run their spaceships. These are the myths that accompany these things, and some of
They're
them are
making up
crazy,
stories.
and some of them, but look at the myths that we are now uncovering. Did Solomon even exist? Where was his temple? Where is his gold? And but we do find banking and the manipulation of mammon, or the manipulation of money and the worship of mammon, going hand in hand with this entire history of the Babylonian Radonites.
Right.
So I'm sure glad that you and your miners have reached Solomon's mines, because I hope there's still some gold there left for you guys.
Well, there is. I mean, it's called De Beers Consolidated Mines, and it's run by the British. The
Gold and
Rothschilds own it.
gold and diamonds, portable assets. This is what controls all banks, being
Right.
able to supposedly move around assets so that then you can get more money out of thin air. But you have been tracking it down, and now we've literally got to the point where we're saying, yes, I would absolutely say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the money in the Rothschild gold bullion vault in the city of London is certainly gold from King Solomon's mines.
That's one. I was going to ask you that. Do you think it's in Zurich at the gold vaults there, or in London, or is it in Fort Knox?
It would be the old gold. It'd be the Rothschild gold, and then some of the old gold from the Prussian Empire that Hitler stole, and then the gold from the East it would be quite different, and that's the Yamashita gold. So, and that the Yamashita gold and the Nazi gold is what's in the Zurich vaults. So, I would say that literally, good old King Charles's backup of the British Bank of England is
Mhm.
literally gold that rascal Solomon captured and started all of this nonsense with.